Hi there, welcome to my video, and in this tutorial I'll try to show you how to set up a Kubernetes cluster on AWS. It's pretty straightforward and doesn't take very long. These are the requirements before you start. You need to have an AWS account if you don't have one already. The CLI for AWS, you need to have that installed. We'll be using kops to install the cluster and kube control to manage the cluster. Now kops is available on Mac and Linux. I'm not sure about Windows yet, but please do look up on the internet. You'll also need to create an account, or if you'd like to use an existing account, please make sure that the account has got these privileges: the EC2 IAM, S3 bucket, and VPC, and also the Route 53, because the cluster will need to create some of the DNS records. So yeah, it will need to have the Route 53 access. And you'll also need to create a public key for your Mac or Linux machine to be able to access your AWS account and create resources. On a Mac, I'm using a Mac, so it's pretty straightforward. All you do is just run this command, ssh-keygen -t rsa, and you'll go through some of the instructions. It'll ask you to type in the passphrase, and then you'll be able to save your the public key locally, and then you'll need to upload it onto your associate that to your AWS account. Let me just show you quickly how you can do that. SSH. So once you run that command, you'll be asked to type in the name of the file. In my case, I've already created one and saved it to my desktop, but here, just so you know, I'll just show you pub key, which already exists. I know, yes, overwrite it, and you need to provide the passphrase. So yeah, then your public key is ready. All you have to do now, you just log onto your AWS account, associate this key to your to the user account that you have. I'm using a user account called Cube, and there is my SSH key, public key. So all you have to do is just open the file that you saved, copy the content and just paste it here, then upload SSH public key here. So this way you will not get any security related issues while creating resources on AWS account. Okay, so that is done. Moving on to the next one is you need to have these tools available on your Mac or Linux machine. AWS CLI is the CLI used to interact with AWS. And kops and kube control I've mentioned already. On a Mac, I'm using a package manager called Homebrew. Let me show you. So you can just type in brew and then install kops AWS CLI and also kube control. Sorry, it's my mistake, not cruise, brew. I already have these tools installed on my machine, so I'll get the warning saying kops, AWS CLI and kube control. The CLI, they're all installed, so I don't need to do it. But if you run this command again, and if there is an update, it will download the updated version. So brew is a package manager. If you are familiar with Windows, Choco is something similar. Right, okay, so moving on to the next step. We're going to create a bucket first of all. So now this bucket will hold the configuration of the cluster and also the state information, and it will also need to be able to version control. So it will need to have the versioning enabled. We don't want to delete the file, so we want to keep all the different versions. Now I'm again going to use the AWS command line to create a bucket. Paste it. So it's quite simple. I'm actually querying the S3 API, create bucket, this the bucket name, and the region I've set is US East 1. As you know, the buckets are uniquely named, so my one is available and I've got it now. Right, so let's enable the versioning. I'm just going to copy the next one. Yes, again, we're actually making an S3 API call to AWS. So put bucket versioning, bucket name is exactly the same one as before. And the versioning configuration status is enabled. You have to do this. Moving on to the next slide. We're going to use the environment variables. Now, you could have multiple clusters within the same region. You don't really want to mess with your environment, so it's safer to define these environment variables and stick to those rather than messing with the entire environment. So I'm going to export kops cluster name. I've called it d2.k8s.local. I will also need to export the kops state store, which is essentially the S3 bucket address. Done already. So kops state store is s3://dt-kops-store. That's exactly the same bucket that we just created earlier. Right. Okay, so that's been done. Moving to the next slide where we actually create the cluster. First, we'll define the cluster. Define the cluster, and then we'll update the cluster name with the appropriate name. And we'll also then update the cluster itself to create the cluster. Okay, now let's just go one by one. So the first one, we'll just create the cluster. Before we do that, let's go and have a look on the S3 bucket. So it should be empty at the moment. Yeah, so the bucket is empty. It's version controlled. I'm going to just create the cluster with define the cluster basically. So let me just go ahead and copy and paste. So create cluster, node count is 2. We've set node 2 nodes. Yeah, depending on your requirements, you can set the counter to n or 10, 15, whatever is needed. Node size is too small because I'm only going to show you how to create it. In reality, you'll probably have to set like a bigger instance of EC2. And also maybe for demoing you could choose T2 micro. In that case you'll not be charged at all. Zone is US East 1A. That's what I've specified. And yeah, so it's created the configuration. Let me just go back to the bucket and you'll see some files there, like instance group, cluster specifications, and then config. So those files have been created. Now I'm actually going to associate the public key that we have created so we can actually spin up the cluster on AWS. So this is very important. Let me just go back and show you that it told you SSH public key must be specified when running with AWS. Okay, otherwise you'll run into issues. It's not going to create anything. Now the second line, so kops create secret. That's the name of the cluster, and then SSH public key. This public key that we created earlier on, I have got it saved on is the same location as desktop. But if you are using the SSH key stored somewhere else, then please do specify the path completely. Otherwise, it will not work. You'll get an error message. That's all been done, and now we're actually going to update the cluster. Okay, so I'm going to update the cluster. It will create a bunch of certificates and also set up the cluster for me. There you go. It's all been done. Right, okay, so we have got to also specify yes to apply the changes. Sorry, I should have actually included that into my instructions. So if you don't force it, it will not apply the changes. So it's going to run the same, run through the same process again. Like it's just waiting. Right, okay, so the cluster is starting. Okay, now it could take a few minutes depending on how you set up and which region you're actually working on. Until then, if you try to, as you can see, there's some suggestions, validate your cluster, it will return an error message. Let me just go ahead and try that. So kops. If you try to validate, it will say unexpected error during validation because your instances are still being created. Let me just go ahead and refresh it. Okay, so even though it says it's running, but it's still initializing, as you can see. So once that's done, we should get some response saying, yeah, your cluster is actually ready. After waiting for a few minutes, I'm getting this response. It is responding, but it's still saying validation failed because these are the nodes, they haven't joined the cluster yet. So I'll give it another few minutes. After another couple of minutes, I'm getting this validation error. The master is ready, looks like, and the nodes, they're not ready yet. So I'm gonna give it another few minutes. Okay, after waiting for at least 5 minutes, I'm finally getting this message saying that my so node status, everything, your cluster is ready, which is great news. And as you can see, that master, that's the M3 medium, and there are 2 nodes actually, T2 small. It's all ready, so that's great news. But bear with it because it could take a few minutes. So if you get the validation errors, please do bear with it, and it will eventually work. Now, so again, validating the cluster, you can use this kops update cluster. Obviously, I've done that already. That's just part of the creation of it. Now, don't forget that you have to specify yes to apply the changes. So once that's been done, it will take several minutes to complete the deployment process. And then the kops validate cluster, we'll just run it, and you keep on running it until your cluster is ready. Then from this point on, you can use the kube control CLI, okay, to get the nodes. So let's just try that. Okay, so these are the nodes, and they're all ready. Okay, the master and node and node. Now, don't forget that you could have multiple masters. In that case, one will be acting as a leader, and the other one will be kept for redundancy. So yeah, that can be done as well. But this is a very basic example of Kubernetes cluster on AWS. All right, so we'll move on to the next slide. Now, the next one is, obviously, we have got the Kubernetes cluster ready, but how do we get some sort of like a user interface, like a dashboard sort of thing? So I've got the visual, to visualize this setup or the cluster. How do we do that? It's pretty straightforward. If you just simply Google so yeah, Kubernetes dashboard, and there is a GitHub project. It'll take you to that project, and it is there. Basically, all you have to do is just run the kube control command, and it will install the dashboard for you. So I'm just going to copy this command. It's exactly the same one. Let me just clear it. Right, paste it, and it should give me the dashboard. Okay, so it's created, that's what it says. Now that we have the dashboard installed, we'll move on to the next slide and try to log on to the dashboard. Now, what you do at this stage is you copy the API URL, which is the hostname, from the info, which is the cluster information, and then just copy everything else from this / so it's API/v1/namespaces/cube-system/Kubernetes-dashboard : you can exclude the rest of it. So let me just bring up the terminal. So from the cluster information, you can grab the host name and then add the rest of it. Okay. So let's just go ahead and see what happens. So if I put it into the browser, so this is what I get. Now, because I've logged into this before, it's not asking me for the username and password. Username is admin, and the password you get by executing this command, which is cops get secrets cube, and then type is secret, output plain text. So that will generate a password for yourself, and you could actually save it in somewhere safe. So every time I generate it's exactly the same, right? Okay, so I use this one to log on. Now once you've logged on, you'll get this this window, kube configure token. I'm gonna select token. Now once you select token, you'll need to add a token. If you skip, you will get some sort of like error message on the screen, because the role-based access control needs this setup. To generate a token, let me just go back to my PowerPoint. So that's the command. So cops get secret admin. In this case, we're actually going to generate a secret for admin, okay, instead of cube, and then type is secret, and the output is again the plain text. So let me just go ahead and do that. So secret type is admin. Okay, and that's the token I've got. And sign in. There you go. So that's my Kubernetes dashboard. These are the nodes, and this overview, storage, roles. That's great. It's all there. So in the next video, I'll show you how to deploy a container onto this cluster and how to access it. Thank you very much for watching.